It's a really amateurish murder. The chances of getting away with it were minuscule.
Of Lucan himself, nothing has been seen since his children's nanny was found battered to death.
Dreadful crimes were committed at number 46.
It's never going to be a difficult one for the police to solve.
Lord Lucan's estranged wife was also attacked.
In the days that followed his disappearance, exhaustive police searches of the south coast produced no clue.
It's not a case which can be described as a whodunit.
I wish to interview him, and I'd like to interview him as soon as possible.
But it is a story which has captivated journalists around the world, police officers and the general public for half a century.
Claims this year that he shot himself before being fed to a tiger.
And as this investigation will reveal,
Wife said she believed he was in South America.
I have identified another high society British aristocrat.
I don't think he'll come back. He would have made another life for himself.
Who helped Lucan and actually met him in the mid-1980s in the Philippines to pick up a false passport so that he could remain at large. And this rogue peer, suspected of being an international drug trafficker, a fugitive, a fraudster, he even called himself a thief and a scoundrel, was Lord Anthony Moynihan. My name is Stephen Wright and this is Daily Mail Investigates. This appalling murder is frequently referred to as the Lucan murder, which is disrespectful, I feel, to the victim of his crime, and that is the nanny, Sandra Rivett, a mother of two, aged 29, whose life was ended in the most brutal circumstances. Because according to the police, Lord Lucan murdered her thinking she was his estranged wife, Lady Veronica Lucan. So I'm going to take you back to November 1974 and the scene of the murder, a 5-storey house in Lower Belgrave Street, central London, a mile or two from Buckingham Palace, most famous residence in the UK, certainly one of the most famous residences in the world. So Lord Lucan was somewhat of a playboy, was an obsessive gambler. Here's him photoed at the Claremont Club. People might say in today's language he was a gambling addict. His nickname was Lucky, Lucky Lucan, but not because he was good at it. It's an ironic nickname. Often people would say his wife Veronica was there watching him, totally bored, as her husband frittered away their fortune. He was a keen sailor. He owned racehorses. He was into bobsleighing, and it's also said that he once did an audition to play James Bond. He had no acting background, no acting pedigree, but you can see he was a good-looking man. You can understand why the producers of James Bond might have thought he would look the part, certainly. This is Lord Lucan and his wife Veronica on their wedding day. I mean, initially it was a happy marriage. By the early 70s, certainly, the marriage was under huge strain. And that really was going to set the chain of events that would result in murder, because by early 1973, he had left the family home and was involved in a bitter custody battle over the 3 children, but he employed private detectives to spy on his wife, to gather intelligence about what was going on in the family home. He was obsessed with his wife in getting custody. In today's language, you'd call it stalking. In the end, he concluded that the only way he could get custody of his children was to remove his wife from the scene. So this is the police report sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions in 1975, 60 pages long, and it goes into great detail in terms of setting the scene. The officer who wrote the report, Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Ransom, concludes that he had no doubt at all that Lord Lucan was the killer. Page 6 of this report, Ransom discusses the incident, how on the evening of Thursday, November the 7th, 1974, Lady Lucan was on the 2nd floor of her house watching TV with Lady Frances, their daughter. Mrs. Rivett returned to Lady Lucan's bedroom and inquired if she would like a cup of tea. It is believed she collected some dirty cups and saucers and left the room to go to the basement kitchen. Lady Lucan and her daughter continued watching the TV until about 9:15, when, as Mrs. Rivett had not returned, she went to inquire as to what was the delay. On reaching the top of the stairs, she was surprised to see there were no lights in the basement and called out, "Sandra, Sandra." It was at this moment she heard a noise from the anteroom leading to the cloakroom and was immediately struck on the head by somebody she did not recognise. She fell to the ground and started to scream. Her assailant stuck his fingers down her throat and told her to shut up. It was then that Lady Lucan realised that her husband was the attacker. She bit his gloved fingers. A struggle ensued, during the course of which she grabbed hold of her husband's genitalia. Lord Lucan seemed to lose his strength, and Lady Lucan began desperately talking to save her life. There was a conversation between them during which he admitted killing Sandra. She convinced her husband they should retire to her bedroom in order to wash her wounds. And when they reached the bedroom, Lord Lucan switched off the TV. When he went to the adjoining bathroom, she seized this opportunity and escaped from the house, ran about 200 yards to the Plumber's Arms pub and collapsed in the bar. And to the first officers on the scene, she screamed hysterically, "He's killed our nanny!" As she was taken to hospital, the police went to Lower Belgrave Street. At the crime scene was found the murder weapon, a piece of lead piping 8 to 10 inches long. The house was very poorly lit and numerous switches, fittings and/or bulbs were defective on the ground floor and in the basement. There appeared to be 2 separate seats of the attack, one in the small well of the stairs on the ground floor. Here the carpet was heavily soaked with blood and there were directional splashes of blood on the wall and the ceiling. The second seat of attack was confined to the breakfast room in the basement, near to where the body was found. And then the report moves to Sandra Rivett's body, which had been placed in a canvas sack, which suggested, according to police, the intention of removing the body from the scene. What's in my hand here now is a crime scene picture. It really brings home the atrocity that this is. Sandra Rivett's body is inside a sack and blood seeping out of it. A discarded shoe to the left of her body as I look at it now. I think it's too horrific really to put this picture up on screen now. But it just reminds you that although the Lucan case has sort of had a Hollywood sort of element to it, a woman was brutally murdered and discarded like a broken toy. A lot of police turned up, quite possibly too many. The crime scene was trampled over, blood was taken out into the garden by police dogs. So forensically, a mess, even though very quickly Lord Lucan emerged as the prime suspect. It really was a very challenging night for detectives at Scotland Yard because there was an IRA bomb attack on a pub in southeast London, the King's Arms in Woolwich. I can imagine that the next day the Met Commissioner at the time would have had a very, very intense day dealing with a fugitive at large and terrorists on the run. Later that night he turned up in Sussex at the home of a woman called Susan Maxwell Scott. He spent 2 or 3 hours with her. She became the subject of Scotland Yard inquiries as the last confirmed person to see Lord Lucan. It says, this woman's strange behaviour was again illustrated when, during the early hours of Monday, January the 26th, 1975, she contacted the Daily Mail newspaper alleging she had received a telephone call from post office telegrams. Quote, "Tell mother all went as planned. I am safe here. Love, John." Close quote. This matter came to light through an article in the Daily Mail, but Mrs. Maxwell Scott did not inform police until 12:50 p.m. that day, and when re-interviewed was of the opinion it was a cruel hoax. Roy Ranson, the Detective Chief Superintendent, doesn't really pull punches in relation to her as a witness. During the course of this investigation, I have been led to believe that Mrs. Maxwell Scott had an infatuation for Lord Lucan, and this may well be the reason for her reluctance in telling the whole truth. What the police chief is effectively saying is that by delaying coming forward, that she might have been helping him to have extra time to make good his escape. She was, with her husband, a member of the Lucan set. Lord Lucan's circle of high society friends had a lot of influence, a lot of money, and their own, I would say, warped view on the meaning of honour and justice. Justice for them, it would seem, was making sure that Lord Lucan didn't stand in the dock at court number 1 at the Old Bailey. From everything I've read, both in this document and books and documentaries, a bit of a Lucan-ologist I've sort of turned into over the years, I suppose. The police were not respected by the establishment figures around Lord Lucan. The hypocrisy of the Lucan set is fascinating, disturbing and fascinating, because here they are, being to the top schools in the country. You'd expect that more likely than not they'd have a good moral compass. But that wasn't the case. So after he left Susan Maxwell Scott's house in the early hours of November the 8th, the trail ran cold until 2 or 3 days later, when Lord Lucan's borrowed getaway car, a Ford Corsair, blood smeared, was found abandoned on the British south coast, a place called Newhaven. A matching piece of lead pipe was found in the boot. In 2022, I broke a world exclusive story that police had found in Lord Lucan's abandoned car 3 cards from the popular board game called Cluedo, and they were the cards Colonel Mustard, the lead piping, and the location, the hallway. Now, that was a cryptic clue. Were they put there by Lucan? Were they put there by his friends, almost taunting the police, or planted there by some rogue detective with a sick sense of humour? One of the big questions over the years has been, did Lord Lucan dump that car there, which he'd borrowed off a friend, or did someone do it on his behalf as some sort of decoy? Right by the coast there was a ferry to France from nearby, and the popular theory at the time was that he'd got on the ferry and maybe jumped to his death. The thing that undermines that theory, police have always said to me, is that nobody ever turned up. Lucan had left his passport in his bachelor pad around the corner from the family home in Belgravia, but that wouldn't have created much of an obstacle to getting out of the country. One theory is that he was flown out of the UK in a private aircraft from an airfield in Sussex, or certainly the southeast. Everything I've gleaned from this report suggests that the police believed that not only was Lucan being protected by his high society circle, but had he been caught, it would have been a dirty trial, where Sandra Rivett's reputation, character would have come under fierce attack, and Lord Lucan would have had the best legal representation that money could buy. Within days of the murder, the trail went cold. Within weeks, police were in northern France holding press conferences believing that Lucan had turned up there, but there was no definitive sighting. In the 1970s and the 1980s, a number of alleged sightings of Lucan around the world. The theme, without wishing to sound too cynical, seemed to be that they're in hot places. The longer the saga, the mystery went on, the more bizarre the theories became about what had happened to him. I recall in my days as chief crime correspondent at the Daily Mail, there being a claim that Lord Lucan had lived out his final days as a hippie in Goa, known as Jungly Barry. In fact, I wrote a front page story about that after it featured on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. By Sunday afternoon, I realised it was a load of hogwash, and Jungly Barry was not Lord Lucan. There's also claims that Lord Lucan has lived in New Zealand in a Range Rover or Land Rover with a pet possum. Also claims that he was fed to a tiger. I don't know who witnessed that, but I don't think that claim was really ever taken seriously. And looking back now, 20 years ago, which marked the 30th anniversary, at a time when the police had reopened the inquiry, on page 5, the Daily Mail, written by myself, there's an image of how Lord Lucan would have looked then, age enhanced and approaching his 70th birthday. And that was done by an expert at the then named National Missing Persons Helpline, which takes me really to another significant story. In 1994, the Daily Mail set up a £100,000 reward for information leading to conclusive proof about what had happened to Lord Lucan. I can say that that reward prompted about 200 letters from around the world. And my distinguished former colleague David Williams, who was coordinating the Mail's response to that and working with Scotland Yard officers at the time, recalls that 6 letters alleging that Lucan had been in Africa were of particular interest to the Metropolitan Police at the time. But again, no sign of Lucan, no conclusive proof that he was in Africa or had been in Africa. The new investigation, one which I think is probably the most exciting development, certainly in my career covering the Lucan case, the suggestion from a very credible witness that 7,000 miles away from London in the mid-1980s, Lord Lucan was in the Philippines meeting up with a fellow rogue peer to pick up a false passport so that he could remain at large from Scotland Yard. This is not the story of just one rogue aristocrat. It is, my investigation reveals, about a second bad boy peer, a man called Lord Anthony Moynihan. He was the 3rd Baron Moynihan of Leeds, and he was a very colourful character. Lovable rogue, some might say. I would disagree. Like Lord Lucan, had started his life with the finest education going. He went to another of Britain's top public schools and also did national service with Lord Lucan. He was, according to official reports, suspected of being an international drug trafficker, a fugitive, a fraudster, a 5 times married bigamist. He even called himself a thief and a scoundrel, a brothel keeper. He owned 7 such establishments, including one in Bangkok, the rest in the Philippines. A sex trafficker, according to a police document which we uncovered from the States. He was suspected of exporting 25,000 sex workers from the Philippines to around the world. He was also suspected of being involved in the murder of a boyfriend of one of his ex-wives. He was on the run from Scotland Yard for fraud. That case from the early 70s involved a cheque bouncing for a Rolls Royce that he'd purchased. And by the mid-80s, he'd turned supergrass to help the authorities bring down Howard Marks, Mr. Nice, the infamous drugs baron. As part of our extensive investigations into Lord Moynihan's life and extraordinary criminal career, went to the United States, to Atlanta, and unearthed court transcripts from 1989 when Moynihan gave evidence against Howard Marks. Moynihan admitted in a public arena how he had procured false passports, false identities for his criminal associates, using the services of an old school friend of his, a corrupt society lawyer called James Newton. This was particularly telling for me because it corroborated significantly the account given to me by Moynihan's 4th wife, Editha, of how Moynihan had helped Lord Lucan obtain a false identity. And that was the reason why he went to their home in Manila in the mid-80s. I've been to Manila on several occasions in the past for the Daily Mail, 3 times to expose a Filipino nurse who murdered patients at an NHS hospital near Manchester, being there to expose a well-known British fraudster, John Darwin, aka Canoe Man. I was in Manila looking at the life of the British banker Rurik Jutting, who murdered 2 sex workers in Hong Kong. I was doing a piece on his life in the Far East, his trips of debauchery to a sex capital, Angeles City. It's a fascinating place to work as a journalist because, without wishing to stereotype, this is a place rich in material for journalists like me. There was a reason why Moynihan went to Philippines in the early 1970s. He was a wanted man in London. He was wanted for fraud. He was described in the Old Bailey in his absence as the evil genius behind a string of frauds. Philippines, Manila in particular, good place to hide in plain sight from the authorities. And Moynihan used to claim that President Ferdinand Marcos, the dictator of the Philippines in the 70s and up to the mid-80s, was a drinking chum of his. No doubt at all that Marcos gave Moynihan protection. There is a seedy part, there is a corrupt part of life in Manila, sadly, like in many developing sort of countries. Political corruption, police corruption is a major problem there. He fitted in well. As part of my investigations, went to his grave went to his old hotel, went to what remains of his old sort of massage parlours, stroke brothels. Manila was the perfect place for someone who was arguably utterly corrupt. Utterly fascinating man to research and write about, but to depict him as some sort of lovable rogue, I think that would be inappropriate and offensive possibly to the women who he trafficked and those who might have been hooked on the drugs which he was trafficking around the world. There's something fortuitous around how I got onto this story. I've been fascinated by him as a criminal since his death, aged 55, in Manila in 1991. At the time I was working in Hong Kong. Hadn't become a crime journalist then, but had a close interest in his life story because he was like a James Bond style supervillain. While researching, I made an approach to Moynihan's fourth wife, Lady Editha Moynihan, and she agreed to meet me for dinner in Manila, the Philippines capital, and within 20 minutes of talking about her incredible life as a member of the inner circle of her husband's sort of criminal enterprise. She's not a criminal herself, I might add. She dropped into the conversation that she had met Lord Lucan in the mid-80s, that he was an old friend of her husband's from London, and that he'd come to pick up a fake passport so he could travel around the world. So that was a bit of a gobsmacking moment for me. Let's have a look at some of my interview with Lady Moynihan. Around 1984, you were in Manila, you were newly married to Lord Moynihan, and you had a surprise visitor.
Yeah, Tony told me that there's this very special person that is coming over.
Yeah.
And we were at the hotel at that time. And he walked in. It was actually quite surprised, actually, because he looked a bit like Tony, and Tony I knew didn't have any brother apart from Colin. And there was this man whose demeanor, his actions, the way he was dressed and the way he spoke, it's very much like Tony, this mole here.
This picture of Lord Lucan was taken in 1963, so 20 years before you say you met him. Does that man resemble?
Yes, but a bit chubbier, bigger actually. That's a skinny man there.
Yeah.
And he's got a mole, big mole, and he's clean. He's got none of this stuff. Yeah. And his hair was white, styled together.
Yeah.
But the thing is that mole actually takes over the whole thing. Like you can't really look at his eyes anymore, nor his nose, you just look at the mole.
Some people watching this interview would be curious to know is how could you have a false mole? I guess that's what you're saying, isn't it? He'd had a false mole put on his face?
Yeah.
Is that what you suggest? Could you do that then? Were you aware of that?
Yes, tattoo. Tattoo.
Probably late 84/85 when this meeting happened, according to her. She and her husband owned a hotel in a particularly seedy part of Manila called the MacArthur Hotel, and she and her husband and Lord Hertford were there, and her husband said that I've got a very special friend coming to visit us, and she says that this tall, charming, good-looking man turned up, spoke like her husband, public school accent, and they went by car back to their mansion. How was he introduced to you? Because you said he had Tony said he had a special friend coming.
Richard, but the thing is, they hugged each other like long-lost friends, and Michael called him, the old chap, what are you doing?
Michael Hertford being Lord Hertford.
Marquis of Hertford, yes.
Yeah, who was living in the Philippines as well.
Oh yeah.
At that stage, so they sort of all knew each other.
Oh yeah, Tony and Michael are quite close actually. They were always socially together. Tony was going to be cooking, and he will only cook when it's someone special coming over to the house. So there was Tony, there is Michael, me, and Richard.
Her stepfather, who was from the UK, called her, and she said that they had a mystery guest called Richard Bingham. He said immediately, that's Lord Lucan.
I don't know whether Tony told me that his surname was Bingham, but I knew that my mother's demeanor after that, the way my mother was talking after that changed. And my stepfather said that he's a murderer.
She confronted her husband over this, and he was very defensive.
At night, and I was asked Tony. I said, this Richard, who is he? I said, well, he's actually Richard Bingham.
Yeah.
And said, because my stepfather said that he's a murderer. I said, look, There is no proof to that. Unless the man admits that he's actually done it. There is no proof. I said, yeah, same thing in the Philippines. People goes to jail and there's no proof. It's just to cover up for somebody who's actually guilty but is richer.
During the course of the night, Lord Hertford hinted that Richard was a lord himself.
And it was Michael. So there's actually a lord too, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I said, really? I said, don't you see a lord too? And he said, yes, actually Lord Lucan. But his name is Richard. Don't call him Lord Lucan.
Why did he come to the Philippines?
He had his British passport. It just came in from Jimmy Newton.
Jimmy Newton was a solicitor in the UK who's been linked publicly for basically providing passports in false names. Yeah.
Yes.
In the 1970s, it would have been very easy to get a fake passport, and she explained, as did James Newton in court, how easy it was. You could go to public register of births, marriages and deaths, look for the death of a child who died, let's say, aged 2 in the 1930s when Lucan was born, then look for the birth certificate and then create a new identity out of that dead child's details. Make an application to the passport office, get someone to verify you've known this person for X number of years, and it was as simple as that, and get a new passport. You know, so according to Editha's account, Lord Lucan was using the name of a tragic young child who died to travel around the world. Just playing devil's advocate, is this, you know, could this have been a joke that it was his Lord Lucan? Could this have been?
No, actually, he's given me a gift. Actually, it was a gift, a necklace. He's given me. It came from Thailand, obviously, because it was Thai shop.
Right.
And the jewelry obviously came from Thailand because of the precious jewel. Precious stone. Was a signature. Then after that was something funny because I think they were already smashed by the time. He said, and he said to me, you know, one day, Lady Moynihan, this is going to be of use for you. And Tony said that being the youngest, I'll be the one who's actually going to reap these things that are given. The necklace, the card, and the hair.
It was a very boozy night, according to her account. Wouldn't be surprising if the guard was dropped. Let's remember that by then, Lucan had been on the run for 10 years. He's an arrogant man anyway, by all accounts. You could understand why he might feel untouchable, and that no one from that gathering in Manila would shop him to Scotland Yard or any other police force. Some people might say this story sounds a bit far-fetched.
I've got his hair, I've got his signature.
Right.
Let's have it tested. Why would Tony lie to me?
Yeah.
Who that person is, or was, in that matter. And why would Michael tell me that too? What do they gain from that? What is there to gain from lying to me?
What was it about Manila which made criminals want to come here or feel safe coming here, maybe in the 70s and 80s?
I don't want to sort of like talk about my country in that sort of manner.
No, of course not. No.
But if you're a criminal, Philippines is probably the best place to actually go.
Yeah.
If you've got the money.
Yeah. And particularly that era.
Yeah, particularly that era. Not anymore.
I went away and looked very closely at what she was saying, trying to find further evidence. I've just been into the lobby at the Sogo Hotel in Malati, central Manila. It was here, then named the MacArthur Hotel, owned by Lord Moynihan, that Lord Lucan is said to have come to pick up a bogus passport for Lucan to use to travel around the world. Looking around this environment, there's a couple of massage parlours across the road, the Love Bar across the road here to my left as I look. It's quite a sort of squalid environment, certainly compared to the sort of hotels that Lord Lucan would have been accustomed to back in the days before he allegedly committed murder. You know, he would have been hanging out at the likes of the Ritz and the Dorchester, I would imagine. But this is very much a low-rent backstreet hotel, and you have to wonder, really, what was Lord Moynihan doing investing in this property, this hotel? And the more I delved into his background, the more it seemed to make sense to me that he might have had an association with Lucan back in the late 60s, early 70s, and that they would have stayed in contact because they were both fugitives from Scotland Yard, albeit Moynihan for fraud, not murder. But they both served in the Coldstream Guards around the same time in Germany. They had an overlap of friends, they were gamblers, they were part of the establishment, yet they were anti it. But it sort of made sense that of all the things being written about the Lucan case, this was really what I think can be accurately described as a highly credible account. It was really a question of joining the dots, and it was very mindful, given that there have been so many false alerts over the Lucan story, very mindful that people would be sceptical about her account, about what she said happened, but she didn't ask for money. She didn't approach me with the story. I was looking into her late husband's life, and she dropped us into conversation. You know, the way she described it, quite casually, well, he was just a number of people who used to pass through Manila and visit her husband. Manila in that era was a haven for fugitives. It was a great place to go to if you wanted to hide from the world, and there also wasn't an extradition or treaty agreement with the UK. So if you were a person on the run, wanted by the police in the UK, Philippines is a good place to hide. You could even hide in plain sight and stick two fingers up at Scotland Yard because they weren't going to get you back. So it sort of made sense to me that, well, that's where Lord Moynihan went and where Lord Lucan could go without fear of being arrested and put on a plane to London. From her reference to a lock of hair, at first I thought, well, this is really bizarre. Surely it couldn't have happened. But she was a naive, in her own words, young Filipino woman in her early 20s when this meeting, she says, happened. She didn't really know who Lord Lucan was initially or how big the story was. But I don't think she still does, really. She said that Lucan and the others said that this lock of hair would be very valuable to you in years to come, and Lucan and Moynihan were hinting that it would embarrass the Met, Scotland Yard, if she is able to produce that lock of hair, which she says is stored, like a box of mementos, and it turns out to be Lord Lucan. It's just amazing. And there's a small problem that the Met don't actually have a confirmed DNA for Lord Lucan. So any hair sample would be worthless unless one of the Lucan children were happy to share their DNA sample with the paper for comparison. I feel, and there's more to come out on this I'm sure, that she gave a highly plausible, highly credible account, which in due course could rewrite the history book. But there are so many unanswered questions. Where was Lucan living at the time? Was he living in the Philippines or in Thailand, as Editor Lady Moynihan believes? Who was supporting him? How was he earning money? And is there somewhere a grave? I sincerely hope that my continuing investigations into Lord Lucan and the murder of Sandra Rivett, that somehow I can shine real light on his fate and who helped him. And to be able to do that would be the highlight of any journalist's career. I feel that it's not over yet, this story. 50 years on, I'm happy to keep going in quest for greater understanding of what happened and justice for Sandra Rivett. I'm Stephen Wright, and this has been Daily Mail Investigates.